Hello folks, and welcome back to my channel, and welcome to the latest episode of Your Questions Answered. Thank you, as always, for your continued support, for all your comments and all your questions. I do read every single one of them, which is how we end up having these new episodes of Your Questions Answered. Thank you for your subscriptions. If you haven't hit the subscription button, hit it right now, and don't forget to hit the notifications bell so you know when each new episode has been uploaded. Also, if you look down below, we have a merch line. I have gone full YouTube douchebag with my own line of merchandise. But fear not, 20% of all profit is going to go to charity. Got a great charity lined up in the US, Every Kid Sports, who I'm really proud to be championing and partnering with this year as part of their We Pay Kids Play nationwide program, which aims to allow kids from low-income families across the US to participate in sports. I'll be partnering with a UK charity as well for all of the sales from the UK side of the merch store, and I'll be announcing who that will be in a couple of weeks' time. But all sales made from both stores, 20% of all profit is going to go direct to charity. Right, shall we do this? Latest episode of Your Questions Answered is going to feature a topic which has been discussed widely for decades, but particularly this year, and it is the subject of qualifying and sprint races. What is going on in 2021? Do we actually need this change, and what will it look like? I want to start this off by saying I really want to hear your opinions. I'm genuinely interested to know what you think on this topic and what your suggestions might be if you don't think that the sprint race suggestion is workable. What would you like to see from qualifying? Do you think anything needs changing with qualifying? Leave me some responses at the bottom. And who knows, if there's a groundswell of opinion, let's put it in front of Ross Brawn and add to the debate, add to the mix of this topic, which, as I've said, has been swirling for such a long time with no concrete answer. Hopefully we'll get closer today, but by the end I hope you will have formed some opinions and be able to give me your comments at the close. Okay, right, what is being proposed for 2021? And we should point out that right now these are just proposals. Nothing has been voted in, nothing is assured to be happening this season, but there are discussions taking place with a decision, I understand, to be taken before the start of the season. Probably not before the start of testing, but before the first race in Bahrain, we will have a decision one way or another. There is the possibility that at 3 rounds this year, Formula One will trial a new qualifying procedure. Essentially what will happen is the weekend format will look like this. You will have Friday first practice. After Friday first practice, you will have qualifying. And the qualifying will be exactly as qualifying is as we know it, a 3-part, 1-hour qualifying session. That will set the grid not for the Grand Prix, but instead for a sprint race on Saturday, which will be about 1/3 distance, about 100 kilometers, and will provide half points for the top 8 finishes. So 12 for the win, 9 for second, so on and so forth. The finishing positions of this short sprint race will set the grid for Sunday's Grand Prix. Max length, max points. Seems pretty simple, right? Yes, simple. But as we've said, it's yet to be agreed. It is currently being worked on by a working group of team managers, tech directors, and they're sifting through all the details of what they think this sprint race proposal should be. So that's things like, what tyres are used when? Do you get one set for practice and then maybe a different compound for qualifying? Would your qualifying Q2 tyres still be for the Grand Prix on Sunday, or would they be for the sprint race on Saturday? What about the rules and regulations, the point structure, DRS, all these kind of things? They've got to work out before the teams will take that final vote on it to determine if it's a goer or not. As I said, there's no guarantee this gets voted through, but the noises coming out of the teams, at least at the moment, all seem positive. Even from Mercedes and Ferrari, who for a long time had seemed not to be in favour of messing with the weekend format. The fact that it has their support would seem to be key. The question is, though, why? It's a really simple question. but it's a really important one. Why? What's wrong with qualifying, and why risk detracting from the main event with a shorter sprint race? And that's where it gets tricky. You see, there's always been an issue with qualifying in Formula One. By determining a grid on the basis that the fastest start ahead of the slowest, the fastest have a naturally easier time of stretching their legs in the Grand Prix and disappearing off into the distance. The slowest, by comparison, who already have a hard enough time even breaking into the points-paying positions, are immediately penalised before the lights have even gone out on race day. If you make the 100 metres final at the Olympics with the slowest time of the qualifiers, you don't set up a metre behind the runner who set the fastest qualifying time. That would be madness, right? But then again, in Formula One, you can't set up 20 cars alongside one another on the starting grid. That's why there's a problem. And that's why there is the continuing question of what you do to make it slightly fairer. Now, the common barb, which Formula One's detractors use most often, is that the race is usually over by the first corner, or at the very least, by the end of the first lap. Stick Lewis Hamilton in the fastest car, set him off from pole position, and barring anything out of the ordinary, he's going to win the race. And while nobody wants to create a false equivalency or to punish success, there have, for decades now, way before Lewis and Mercedes dominated the sport, been questions as to how you could create a grid that ensured that almost every time you had an exciting contest on the Sunday. It's a discussion that's been had at every level of the sport, from you and your mates in the pub to the F1 Commission, and we've had countless of them among us in the press as well. By far the most memorable for me was one we had, God, it must be 10 years ago now, at a restaurant called the Meat Company, oddly enough, in Bahrain. And after a lot of steak and a lot of red wine, a table of about 10 of us, including Jonathan Noble, Ben Anderson, I think Mark Hughes and Ed Straw might have been there as well. We came to Formula One's age-old question. Now, our starting point was to look at all of our favourite races and to ask, what did they all have in common? And the answer was jeopardy. The favourite, or the eventual winner of the race, had to overcome the odds in order to win the contest. Well, the way in which that happened was either due to the winner starting out of his accepted starting place, so off the front row, or certainly off pole position, a couple of rows back, or weather had played its part in qualifying, meaning that the starting order for the entire grid had been jumbled up. Our thrill came in watching the drivers fight for the win, even if they had the fastest car all the way through practice and quali, and we knew they were going to win. It was watching them have to fight for it. The question then immediately falls to, well, how do you replicate that? How do you consistently ensure that the grid that is set for the race gives us that jeopardy, gives us that potential for thrill and excitement? You could draw lots and make it completely random. Oh no! Cry the purists, you can't do that because it goes against the DNA of the sport. Honestly, I want to scream every time I hear that argument, because the sport has consistently, through its history, from both the sporting and technical regulatory perspective, changed. If it hadn't, we'd still have front-engine cars. We would have cars without seatbelts. We would be racing on tracks that were lined with hay bales. We would have only the top 5 scoring points, and you could choose your best 4 results of the year to go towards your World Championship tally. And pre-war Grand Prix were often determined, the grids were often determined by drawing ballots. So there goes that DNA argument. That thought, though, was a little bit too random. So we started looking down through all of the different levels of single-seater racing all the way down to karting. And it was at karting that we found our inspiration, because we looked at racing in heats and the results of those races then creating the grid for the final. And we all agreed it was a great idea, in theory. You needed that jeopardy, though. And so we came up with the notion of a sprint race to set the grid for Sunday, but where the starting grid for that race, and I'm going to lose probably about 75% of you here, but please stick with me, was to set the grid in reverse championship order. So in today's money, you'd have Mercedes on the back row, Williams on the front row, and off you go. Our idea, and bear in mind, we had drunk an awful lot of red wine by this point, was an elimination race. So each lap, for 20 laps, the driver in last place would be eliminated, thus setting their place on the grid for Sunday. So the driver that ended lap 1 in 20th would start 20th for the Grand Prix on Sunday. On lap 2, the driver in last place, 19th, would line up 19th, 18th, 17th, and so on through the Grand Prix. I know. We called it the Meat Company Accord, and unsurprisingly, it never really gained all that much traction. Now, to a lot of you, this isn't going to come as a surprise, but I have long championed the cause of reverse grids. And again, please don't switch off. Please bear with this. The problem with a lot of these things is that people hear the words reverse grid and they immediately turn off. They immediately say no. But there are some benefits to it, and we have seen examples in recent years where it does work. Look at Formula 2, Formula GP2. Their reverse grid sprint race concept has worked for a decade and a half and provided some thrilling racing. Essentially, the finishing positions of the main feature race on the Saturday set the grid for the sprint race on Sunday, but with the top 10, the points paying positions from that feature race, reversed. It's a slightly, what people would term, gimmicky idea. But because you are doing something unnatural with the grid, the points for that sprint race on Sunday are less than for the feature race. But to win both races in a weekend proved incredibly difficult. It was a real feat, a real show of skill to win both F2 or GP2 races over a weekend, especially as this was a spec series. Now, this doesn't work for Formula 1 because, of course, the Grand Prix itself must always be the feature. It must always come last. So the sprint race is always going to be before rather than after your main event. If we go back to the Meat Company Accord idea, a small tweak could potentially make it workable. You just remove the elimination. It's actually quite similar to what's being proposed now. The concept would still be a Saturday sprint to determine the grid for Sunday, but rather than starting the fastest cars at the front, as in the real Grand Prix, and as is being proposed for 2021, why not give the smaller teams a sporting chance? Start the fastest cars at the back, the slower cars at the front. I want to ask you a question. Where do you think a Mercedes would place if it started 20th at the end of a 25-lap sprint race? And be honest. And no, I'm not talking about Monaco. Monaco is always going to be a special consideration. But anywhere else, 25 laps, Mercedes starts 20th. Where does it finish? That sprint race. Top 10? Possibly top 5. And if the results of the sprint then set the grid for Sunday's contest, you've still got your top teams starting in the higher positions, just not necessarily from pole or the front row, not unless they've had a spectacular sort of 25-lap race on the Saturday. And, crucially, you're giving the smaller teams TV time, rather than toiling at the back as they normally do. You're also creating a situation where teams would be forced to design cars that could overtake. Now, detractors will, of course, claim that this concept is quite simply just a reverse championship order Grand Prix with a red flag thrown in at the end of 25 laps. But how is that any different to what's being proposed in 2021, save for the fact that there's no reverse grids being utilised? Essentially, in 2021, what's being proposed is lengthening a Grand Prix by 1/3 and throwing in a red flag overnight between Saturday and Sunday. Except for one key difference. at the end of that sprint race on Saturday, you're giving points to the drivers who finish in the top 8. So again, you have to go back and ask why. If it's to shake up the grid and create excitement, does the current proposal actually provide that? Or are we simply creating a situation where the top teams have the potential to lead from the front, as they always have done, but not just in one race, now in 2 races, over 2 separate occasions over the weekend, thus potentially scoring even more points and actually exacerbating the gap between the haves and the have-nots? Perhaps that's why Mercedes and Ferrari are on board with this proposal after all. I would argue, and it's why I think the notion of reversing or inverting an element of the grid should be considered, is that if points are to be awarded for the sprint race that sets the grid for Sunday, then just as in F2, the points paying positions in that first race should be reversed for the grid on Sunday. Those extra points can't come for free. Let's be in no doubt, there's no way on earth that if you're fighting for a championship, you're going to deliberately finish 8th or 10th or whatever it might be on a partially reversed grid in order to start from pole on Sunday. You're not going to turn down those 12 points. If you've got the pace to win a Grand Prix or a mini sprint race, super qualifying, whatever we're going to call it, and take those 12 points, you know damn well you've got a car underneath you that can win the Grand Prix from 8th or 10th on Sunday and take the 25 points. There has to be, I would say, a payoff. For the sprint race idea to work, I'd argue you cannot simply have your cake and eat it too. There has to be a payoff. There has to be a penalty for those points on the Saturday. And the reverse or inverted points paying positions for the grid on Sunday, I don't think would be gimmicky. I think would make a lot of sense. You see, you'd still get a stellar sprint race on the Saturday. And on Sunday, you get to watch those same drivers who you've seen contest the race from the front on the Saturday, contest it again, but have to fight for it this time. And that's what ultimately you want, I think, if you're going to try and shake up qualifying. It's to create the excitement, the jeopardy of watching the drivers that you know have the pace really work for a Grand Prix win. The problem though, and if you're still watching, congratulations, because at the first mention of reverse grid, I'm sure quite a lot of people have switched off. The problem is that the teams do the same. As soon as the word reverse grid or the notion of inverting positions on the grid is even mooted, it's shot down and chucked in the bin. The teams just won't entertain it, and I think that's a real shame. I think it's a massive lost opportunity. And if that's the case, what other options are there? Well, personally, I've always loved the single lap qualifying that we had for a couple of years. Maybe reverse the championship order for that running order of the first set of qualifying single laps, and then immediately roll it into the second laps determined by the outright pace of those first lap runs. 20 drivers, average of 1.5 minutes per lap. That's about half an hour, if not more. You could easily pull out an hour, hour and a half's TV show out of it. I don't see why broadcasters would be unhappy with the notion of the single lap qualifying. Get Pirelli to bring back the ultra soft tyre, crank the engines up to full, have proper all out one lap big blast quali. I'd love to see it. Make the changes between the cars and set them up for race spec the next day, because I mean, let's face it, with the amount of changes you can make under like for like in Parc Fermé, it's not really a Parc Fermé anymore, it's more a Parc Ouvert. Let's have proper qualifying, let's have super sticky tyres, turbo engines absolutely cranked up. One lap. I'd love that. Ultimately, there's a lot of positivity here in the fact that this is even being debated, it's even being discussed, and that a vote will be taken, and in all likelihood we will see a different version of qualifying trialled in 2021. That's huge, because in the past these ideas have either been dismissed without trial, or ideas have been forced through without really considering the ramifications and the knock-on effect. So at least if this passes, it'll be great to see how this works out in the real world. But if we're trying one idea, why can't we try out 2 or 3 or more? Why not have one race where you trial the qualifying, super qualifying sprint race as is being proposed at the moment? Why don't you have a second race weekend where you trial it with those points paying positions reversed? Why don't we have one weekend where we trial that sprint race with a full reverse championship order? Why not a 4th weekend where we trial a single lap qualifying session? If we're trying one, why not try out multiple before the new regulations come in 2022? This is the year where we can try things. So why don't we try more than just one thing? The hope, of course, with all of this, though, is that the changes simply aren't needed. With the new regulations coming in 2022, with the budget cap coming in as well, the hope is that the field will be naturally closed up, that the competitive order of Formula One will be closed up and competitiveness on track will increase. And if all of these changes work, we won't even need to touch qualifying. And that would be the biggest positive of all. Well, I've rambled on for quite long enough. I want to hear now from you guys. What do you think? Reverse grid, not reverse grid? Sprint race, inverted results? Keep it as it is, single lap qualifying, or isn't there anything wrong with the format as we had it? Or maybe you like the format as it is right now, but that last top 10 should be a single lap shootout. Let me know your comments below, and I can't wait to read the ideas that you guys come up with. As I said, if there's any that absolutely stand out, or we all sort of culminate on one massive idea, we'll try and get it under Ross Brawn's nose. Why not? Folks, thank you so much, as always, for tuning in. I appreciate it. I appreciate your comments, your support, and all of your questions. Keep them coming. For now, though, from me, that is your lot. Testing is just around the corner, and of course, this will be decided one way or another before lights out in Bahrain at the end of March.